name of God, whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is everlasting. Isaac or Ismail, the only sons offered for sacrifice. We are undertaking this effort of knowing what Mr. Abdus Ghauri, the author of this book, has mentioned on this subject. In this episode, I am going to present before you the chapter which mentions briefly the story of the Bible, which is under review and investigation. And then I'll mention Mr. Ghauri's quotation that he has made from Encyclopedia Biblica. And then I'll let you know what the author has to say about the quotation that he has borrowed from the encyclopedia. First, the mention in the Bible. The story, as I mentioned in the previous episode, is narrated in the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, in chapter 22. The story is longish, but I'm going to just mention the very beginning part of it. It says, "And it came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and get you into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell you of." This is what the Old Testament mentions about the beginning of that story, wherein the son of Abraham was offered for sacrifice. The Encyclopedia Biblica, according to Mr. Abdus Ghauri, which is admittedly one of the most reliable authorities on the subject, it has to mention this on this story. The encyclopedia says, "It has become certain that the story has been considerably altered since it was written to begin with." The encyclopedia goes on to say, "So far, however, as an opinion is possible, the form of the story that was mentioned by Elohist, which was the earlier mention of the biblical text, apart from the detail about the ram, all is his own. It was suggested indeed by circumstances already related in the traditional narratives, but it was molded by himself, and it is bathed throughout in an ideal light. Evidently, this pious writer felt that for the higher religious conceptions, no traditional story would be an adequate vehicle. The course which he adopted shows the writer to have been a great teacher. He admits the religious feeling which prompted the sacrifice of a firstborn son." Unquote. Mr. Abdus Ghauri, the author of the book, he says that what Encyclopedia Biblica mentions, we can draw a few conclusions from that mention. One of the conclusions is that the sacrifice of a firstborn son was considered religious by the people. The second conclusion is that the editor of the Bible, being a pious writer and a great teacher, seeing that no traditional story would be an adequate vehicle, exercised full liberty and molded it by himself as he deemed fit for the higher religious conceptions of his own. The third point that the author wants to put across is that we know from this that alterations and additions have been freely exercised in the story. The fourth point that he makes is that the act of alterations is not merely a supposition, it has rather become certain. Another point that the author mentions is that the alteration is in a considerable volume. It's not just in very limited to a very limited extent, but it's done considerably. Another conclusion drawn by the author is that the main theme of the story relates to the Elohist narrative, that is, the manner the existing translations and texts of Bible they mention the story is actually what was initially done by the Elohist narrative, which, as we have seen in the case of the mention in Encyclopedia Biblica, that it's something which has more to do with the ideas and whims of the editor rather than the original text of the Bible. Another conclusion that the author draws is that it can thus be concluded that although the story relates to the famous event of Abraham's offering his only son for sacrifice, the credibility of none of its details is beyond doubt. Therefore, if one is to consider any of the events of the story on its own merit, after a careful and critical analysis, it has to be done carefully. What is important in the conclusions drawn by the author is that although the story and what it seeks to bring forth is extremely important, the authorities on Bible are acutely aware of the fact, and they don't mince words while expressing their views, the fact that it really has been altered, and there have been religious factors and considerations that have caused those insertions and alterations to take place, to be influencing the text of the Bible. Therefore, if we were to draw serious, honest conclusions from the story, we cannot simply rely on what is mentioned in the text of the Bible. We'll have to take into consideration all other important factors that could cause us to believe that what is apparently mentioned in the biblical text is not completely correct. Of course, this is just the beginning of the presentation of the various different evidences and arguments that lead one to believe that the son mentioned in the book of Genesis chapter 2 as Isaac was not Isaac, but was instead Ishmael. For that, however, you will have to wait for a few more episodes to go through, because the entire book would be attempted to be presented in all these episodes. May God enable us to know what the truth is and open our heart for whatever is correct.